Hi there. Today I want to bring to you a little bit of a different video. The video right now is supposed to be sort of a motivational lead up to the next video I want to release. And the next video is going to be about Facebook's new Rebel algorithm, which is an algorithm that solves two-player zero-sum imperfect information games. So it is very similar to the AlphaZero algorithm or the AlphaGo algorithm, just that line of algorithms that combine search and learning. But whereas the alpha line is in perfect information games, so games where you can see everything like chess or Go, the Rebel algorithm is in imperfect information games. And one example of this is poker. So heads up poker, like heads up Texas Hold'em, no limit, let's say, in this case, is a two-player zero-sum. Let's assume the house doesn't take rake. Two-player zero-sum imperfect information game, which this algorithm Rebel can solve better than apparently anything before it. And Daniel Negreanu, who is a longtime poker pro, has released these polls on Twitter, which I found just to be very interesting. So the timing was very fitting, and I thought I'd sort of make a lead-up video to the next paper video, just to sort of get you into the thinking. If you've never played poker at sort of beyond an amateur level, I sort of want to motivate you what makes this game so interesting, because it seems pretty simple at the start. Okay, so here we go. Daniel Negreanu poses the following question. Poker question for you all. And maybe I should briefly explain how the game works for anyone who doesn't know there. And if you have 1 minute, if you know, just jump ahead 1 minute or so. So at the beginning, you get two cards, your opponent gets two cards. You don't know the opponent's cards, the opponent doesn't know your cards. Then successively on the board, they're going to be revealed first three cards at a time, which is called the flop. Then there's one other card, which is called the turn. And then there's another card, which is called the river. And there are 4 betting rounds. So there's one betting round pre-flop, which is when no cards are on the table. There's one betting round at the flop, one at the turn, and one at the river. And then if the players are still in and haven't folded, the cards are revealed and scored according to the normal rules of poker. So your 2 cards and the table 5 cards, you get to choose any 5 of those 7 to make up a poker hand. Whoever has the better poker hand wins. Okay? So in this situation here, you have aces. So your whole cards are 2 aces, which is the best pre-flop hand. But the board is ace, AK 8, 4, 4. So ace, king, 8, 4, and 4. So that's the board, and which gives you a full house, aces with 4s, okay? Which is the second best hand that's possible on this board. So you have the second best hand. Now, usually you would be happy to put all your money into this board, because the only hand that's better than you is if your opponent has 2 4s. So that is a possibility, right? But it's a very, very, very slim possibility. So you might think, I want to put all my money into here. But now, now comes the tricky part, is you put all your money in here because you say, well, there's only really one hand that beats me. Okay, but you have to think ahead and say, how often does my opponent have that hand? And crucially, how often are they going to give me their money while not having this hand? So let's say your opponent has an 8 and a 9, okay? And so they have a pair of 8s, which, they might think, I have a pair. A pair is okay. But you put in a lot of money. They're probably going to fold that hand, right? So if you put in a lot of money here, they're not giving you any money. So if now, let's say they have like 2 kings, which is a very strong hand on this board. But if you put in like exorbitant amounts of money, still they're going to conclude, well, it's not worth it. Like there are still better hands, so I'm going to fold. So all of this, it's not just a question of which cards do you have. It's not even a question which cards your opponent has. It's a question also of how much money do you put in, because that regulates very much how the strategies are. I hope you can sort of see that. So you always have to think about what possible cards could my opponents hold, and which of these cards are they willing to put in how much money into the pot. And then from that, you can determine, is that profitable for me or not? In this particular situation, there are $5 already in the pot. So all the previous betting rounds, they get collected into what's called the pot. So the pot here, in this case, is $5. And your opponent bets $2 million, okay? So $2 million on the pot, into a pot of 5. It's obviously a constructed scenario, but your opponent now puts up 2 million, okay? So you have to put in 2 million into a pot that's now $2,005. So if you, let's say if you fold, you lose whatever you put in of these $5, though you shouldn't think that's sunk cost anyway. You should simply think I put in 2 million in order to win 5 plus the 2 million the opponent puts in, okay? So obviously this is exactly the reverse of what we looked at. Now your opponent is putting in a ginormous amount of money, okay? And you have the second best hand. So this now gets interesting. Now there is an additional complication here. Would you call or fold against the guy who always goes in on the river every hand? Okay, so this is an additional information. Somehow you know that this person always goes in on the river. So on the river, they always shove all their money all in. That's what you know. Now, a lot of people would lean to an easy call here. A lot of people would say, of course, they're going to all in with any time they're on the river. So of course I'm going to call it the second best hand. There are many hands, and they're going to do this with all hands. But that's not the case. They're just because they always go all in on the river every hand. I think this is slightly underspecified. It's every hand where they get to the river, right? So here, a smart opponent, let's say this is a smart opponent, but for some reason, someone kidnapped their dog and threatens to kill the dog if they don't always go all in on the river. But other than that, they are a very smart player. So they now also know that they always go all in on the river, because you know they always go all in on the river. So what they will do is, once they're on the flop and the turn, they will only ever continue with hands where they would go all in on the river, right? And they don't always have 2 million on the table. They might have smaller values. So when they are on the flop and when they are on the turn, they are very much aware that they have this giant amount of money and that they must go all in if they reach the river. So conceivably, they would fold every hand that they weren't willing to go all in on the river. So they won't have just any cards. That seriously skews their distribution of cards that they could hold, because they make that inference, right? So now you can sit here and say, oh, okay, it's conceivable that they actually hold off on most of their cards. They would fold most of their cards on the flop or turn, given that they must always go all in on the river. So let's actually look at the turn. So let's imagine we do not know that this is a 4, right? So the last decisions are made here, right here, when it's the turn. Here, your opponent will only go to the river with cards where they feel that they can then fully go all in all the way, right? That's because they also know they go all in every time they reach the river. So the question is, what possible range could they do this with? And one possibility is, like, they do it if they know they have 2 million. it's a very risky move to go all in on the river, right? So conceivably, I'd say they would not do it with 2 4s because they can't possibly know that another 4 is coming. The chance is so incredibly slim. However, of course, that strategy now also changes the range of hands that you continue to the river with. So you can be, you knowing that the opponent will only go to the river with cards where they could go all in on the river, also will change your distribution. But just in this particular situation, I would say the following. If this is the case, the opponent can't possibly know that there's another 4 coming. Therefore, their range here, if it includes 2 4s, if it includes those, it will also include something like 2 kings. It will also include something like ace 4 or king 4, like conceivably, because those, maybe not, but 2 8s maybe. But at least 2 kings. So their range is conceivably, yeah, if it includes 2 4s, it must include 2 8s and 2 kings, right? Because these are strictly better at the turn. It could even be any ace because that blocks you from having an ace. So if they can have 4s at the end, they can also have kings and 8s. And just because they can have those hands, it probably makes for a good call here on the river because you are beating kings and 8s on the river. Specifically, the 4s are much more unlikely because the 4 is actually in the deck since we already know it's coming right here. So in this case, I would call because of those whole reasoning, not because I have the second best hand, right? I hope you can sort of see how this back and forth goes. So you assume that your opponent is smart, your opponent assumes that you are smart, and then you sort of reason 1, 2, 3 levels in depth. And of course, if you reason to infinity, that becomes a Nash equilibrium, and that's exactly what this rebel algorithm approximates. I would have guessed that this situation is much more interesting if you reverse the board. So if the board was something like 4 4 8, 4 4 4 4 ace, king 8 or something like this, where your opponent clearly already has the best possible hand before they enter the river. That would make it quite a bit more interesting, I believe. And I don't know what the analysis would be, but let's go on to the next hand. So that would be my guess would be call. I haven't, as you can see, I haven't answered yet. I will after the video, but it's irrelevant because the most comments I read are just like inferring very simple things, which are, as I say, irrelevant. So the follow-up question here is, they're same situation, $5 in the pot, 2 million, opponent bets 2 million all in on the river. Board is the same, you have aces. Would you call or fold against a player you know nothing about? Okay, so here's a player you know nothing about. Now, the you know nothing about is, so now you have to estimate probabilities that the person is brain dead and things like this, right? But what you can do is always just estimate sort of the Nash equilibrium strategy of the situation and maybe go with that, because at least then you cannot lose an expectation. So if you factor in the fact that the person might be dumb or brain dead or something like this, then if you mess up these probabilities, you are in fact exploitable. Though, you know, the exploitability only matters if that situation happens over and over and over and over again, whereas I think this is going to happen to you at maximum once. However, same situation, but your opponent does not go all in on the river every hand. You know nothing about them, right? The board happens as it is, and all of a sudden this person pushes 2 million. Now let's analyze this. So you might think, hey, this person pushes 2 million in a pot of $5. They must hold the nuts very, 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 very often for this to be profitable, right? So they probably hold the 2 4s right here. But then again, if you infer that, you might want to go ahead and fold those aces, okay? You fold the aces. So your opponent thinks about this and they realize, wait a minute, if I can get them to fold aces, which is the second best hand on this board, right? I should probably push this much money a lot more often, because I can, you know, like I can get them off aces. I can probably get them off most hands that they are in this situation with, right? On this board, ace, king 8. We don't know the colors, but there are a lot of hands that get to the river in this situation. So I can bluff them off, a lot of them, by simply pushing 2 million in the pot, right? But then it's this old game. You push 2 million to win $5. This has to work very often. In fact, this has to work now. It has to work like 399,000 out of 400,000 times to break even, right? If it doesn't work even one time, yeah. So if you fold anything but the absolute nuts, your opponent might actually just hold a single 4, because then they know you don't have 2 4s, and then they know you can't possibly have the best hand, and then it can push you off of it. But then, right, if they bluff a certain amount of time, they don't need to bluff often for you to actually make it profitable. And if they do in fact bluff, so let's assume they just bluff if they have a 4, because they know you can't have both 4s because they have one, so you can never have the best hand, and they think if they bet 2 million they can push you off any hand. Now you go ahead and you say, wait a minute, if they bluff whenever they have a single 4, they're much more often going to have a single 4, like maybe they have a 4-9 or something like this. They're much more often going to have a hand like this than 2 4s, just combinatorically, right? So maybe they're actually on a bluff pretty often here if they do this every single time they have a 4. So I can actually call. It doesn't even matter that I have aces, right? I can call with any hand that hits anything on this board is probably going to beat. Though if they have a 4, they have trips. So let's say if they bluff with any hand, I can call with any hand, and they will think about this and say, maybe I shouldn't bluff with any hand, right? I should probably moderate that because the other person will adjust. If they bluff with a 4, they have trip 4s. So even if they bluff with a 4, I might only, and it is a bluff. Like if you have a 4 and you bet 2 million here, that's a bluff. Like you're clearly trying to get someone off of like aces. Because it's not like you don't bet for value 2 million into $5 with this. So I will only call with aces, kings, 8s, ace 4, king 4, 8 4, stuff like this, because they all beat a single 4, right? And now the question becomes again, so there is the number of hands I will call with, like aces, kings, and so on, ace 4. How these are a subset of hands, or maybe not like this, as a subset of hands, probably a large subset of all the hands that I would hold on the river, like that I would get to the river with right here. And they are going to push me off of those hands with any large bet, but this bet is really meant to get me off of those strong hands. So the question is, how often do they do this with a 4 in order to still be profitable? So we get back to this sort of inference of how often can this be a bluff for me to legitimately call here, and that factors in how often I am on the river, and how often on the river I hold one of these hands that I could conceivably catch a bluff with. So you can see that a lot of stuff is going in here. Me personally, I would say that I know nothing about this person. I would probably fold in this case, because if I assume they're smart, they must know that they can only pull this 2 million into $5 thing very very few times if they don't have the absolute nuts in this case. And if they don't have the nuts, it almost doesn't matter what they have. They probably have a single 4, and then the number of hands that I can have on the river that are going to catch a bluff with a single 4 is just too large for them to often bluff right here. Of course, if we both play, if the person plays Nash optimal, then I have like some assignment to call or fold, right? Probability of call, probability of fold that I would do in this particular situation, and it's going to be break even. Okay, last question. Though that might not be true. I might have actually a fixed binary decision here. No, because that influences their strategy too. Yeah. Last question. Same thing, but now, which hand would be better to have if you choose to call? So you choose to call, but now which hand would you rather have in that situation? Would you have king 4 or aces? So some people might say, well, aces, clearly, because aces here is the better hand than king 4, right? Aces is full, has aces full of 4s, and king 4 is 4s full of kings. So let's say you imagine you have king 4. Why would you want to have king 4? You would want to have king 4 because now your opponent can't have 2 4s anymore. Okay, so the possibility of your opponent holding 2 4s is off the table because there are only 4 4s in the deck, and the so you're blocking that possibility that your opponent has 2 4s. So they cannot have the nuts possibly. It's much more probable now that in fact they have a single 4. Right? And they are trying to push you off of something like aces. You see? So it's a bit the same situation as before, and we can remark that king 4 is also in this hands that we would call with. But so are the aces. Now, it all again boils down to what's the frequency of them folding here, and that boils down to what's the proportion of hands that you have here, plus what's the frequency of them that you call with. So the question is, would you rather have aces or king 4? And why would you rather have aces? What would be reasons that you would rather have aces? Well, if your opponent is smart, they might think that, and I haven't thought this through before, but let's just try to figure this out together. Your opponent, so if you'd rather have aces than king 4, that must mean that your opponent would do this conceivably with hands that you beat with aces, but not with king 4. Like you decide to call. That's a given. You decide to call. So now everyone reveals their cards. And so if you say you'd rather have aces, that means you think that your opponent would do this kind of stuff with something like kings or eights or something like this. Something that would beat king 4 but not beat aces. So your opponent might be smart and think, wait a minute, if this person has a 4, right, then they will think that I cannot possibly have 2 4s. And therefore, they will call with a single 4. Even if I bet 2 million, they will think, I have the 4, and therefore they can't have the 4, so this must be one of those rare times where they bluff, right? And then they might say, well, but I have 2 8s, right? I have 2 8s. I beat a single 4. And therefore, I can actually get money out of anyone that's trying to catch my bluff, because they have a single 4. So now the question is, how often does anyone on the river here have a single 4? And again, this is where I go and say the board would be probably more interesting if it was this way around, because it's much more conceivable that anyone has a single 4 lying around if the flop was this already. Though king 4 conceivably is you hit the king on the flop and then you somehow get through to the river. while scoring 2 4s, but it's just not as likely that you still have the 4 around. But still, you can sort of see the thinking, right? So the opponent might think, wait, they're going to call me with any old 4, especially with also with king 4. I have 8s. I beat things like ace 4, king 4. I beat a single 4. My opponent's going to think I only do the 2 million things with 2 4s. My opponent's going to have a 4. They will infer that I can't have a 4. They will call me because they think I'm bluffing, and ta-da-da-da. Okay, so you can see that it goes pretty deep, and then in that case they will push with the 8s, and in that case you'd much rather have the aces right here, because they don't know whether you have the 4 or not, right? But if you have the aces, again, you do not have the 4, and it is very possible that your opponent has 2 4s, and after all, it's 2 million into a pot of $5. They have to have a very good hand very often for this to be profitable. Okay, so this kind of thinking is what computation of a Nash equilibrium in effect boils down to. So we're going to see, I don't know what the correct answers to these is, by the way. Even the Rebel source code isn't open source for poker. The code is open source, but the implementation for poker isn't, and I think the checkpoints for poker aren't. Maybe we won't find out. I would love to hear your opinions on this. Maybe I am completely wrong right here, but this is about what an algorithm like that has to do, and I hope I've sort of given you an overview of why this sort of games are interesting, what these algorithms need to think about, and why it is so much harder than something like chess or Go. Not that the game itself is harder, but you have to constantly reason about things that you do not know, and you constantly have to assign probabilities and combinatorial fractioning. How often does this happen? How often does this happen? And then you have to adjust each time. When you adjust your strategy, you have to think that your opponent can make the same conclusions given the observed state, and they can also adjust their strategy. So that's the difficulty. Those are the questions. I would say you go vote, see what other people have to say, and maybe Daniel will let us know once the polls are over. All right, so that was it for me. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to have the next video out very, very soon about Rebel. Bye-bye.